Hello, I'm going to present to record the fourth lecture of this course on political globalization, which focuses on political globalization. You can watch the recorded lecture in the Moodle room as you did with the previous ones, but I will also give this lecture to all of you in next week, in due time. Okay, political globalization. We will, with political globalization, we start the second stage or the second phase of the course. The first one focused on the development. The second one will discuss political and economic globalization as well as global inequalities. I think that we need a short definition of globalization as an entry point. Actually, we already have one already started to discuss how to define globalization when I gave a lecture on global governance. However, it's important to elaborate a little bit more on that in order to provide more specific tools for the analysis. I expect that you use these concepts in order to make sense of a number of illustrations that we will discuss in the forum, as well as the analysis of the political role of a global corporation. This lecture is particularly focused on your second assignment, where you will analyze the political role of a global corporation. So the first idea is that globalization is complex. By complex, I mean that it's a social change that responds to a variety of factors and a variety of dimensions. You cannot easily assume that globalization is simply simply reflected by a line that graph that maps out a trend in a series of indexes. You have to think that this is a way that these graphs, as the COF globalization index, are ways of representing the social change, but they do not capture the whole set of aspects that are involved. Actually, political globalization means that the social fields of political interplay are no longer restricted to the national state, and actually include national state social fields and national state related social fields, but also include other ones. So we think of social fields. Social fields mean that we look at the actors in relationship to other ones, and we are particularly aware of the context they are defining by their action. National politics is a very clearly established social field where you have parliament, you have elections, so you have governments, you have laws, and so on and so on. However, global and transnational social fields are particularly relevant too, and these social fields can establish new links between local fields that actually operate within national states. So it's complex. Many mechanisms are at stake. Many mechanisms. We cannot assume that it's only capitalism, or it's only the making of an international society, or it's only a set of rational or explicit strategies, or so on. Actually, we have to be aware that we have many theories that really capture many relevant aspects of political globalization, but probably we will need some some ideas from different theories in order to account or to provide an exhaustive account of many phenomena. You should, in this slide, I also remind you of a number of points or assumptions that you should have you should keep in mind. For instance, the connections between cause and effect are not necessarily linear. Sometimes you can see that the increase of a cause provokes a proportional increase of an effect, but sometimes this increase is not proportional. You have also to be aware that social action provokes unintended effects. And when we look at social action in such a complex set of social fields, we have to expect that many unintended effects will be at stake. And finally, let me remind you of the distinction between positive and normative theories. The point is that although some politicians claim that globalization is morally good and actually posits a moral obligation to them, that's quite a fallacious argument. We can observe globalization, that's a positive, that's a phenomenon, we can document it on the basis of evidence, but it does not tell us what we have to do. It simply is an account of reality. Well, the first point has to do with sociology. My second point has mostly to do with geography. Actually, we can almost say the same with different words depending on the discipline. However, it is important to remind you of the role of importance of geography because globalization clearly affects the space. So, when I say social field in when we say social field in sociology, we have also to think. We normally tend to elide the role of the space. In geography, the concept of geographical scale, actually adds the spatial dimension to social fields. Geographical scales are social fields that have different relationships to territories. When we look at a map, we can estimate different. We can see when we look at Google Maps, we easily see that by scrolling up or down, we can approach the map, and then we see something different. We see the streets of a city. But if you put it far away, we can see the whole world. So these quantitative movements provoke qualitative differences. Actually, that's that metaphor, that mathematical metaphor or cartographic metaphor is very relevant for understanding political globalization, because actually a number of changes a number of undergoing changes are generating new geographical scales. The most significant of these changes have affected the constitution of the so-called modern nation state. Actually, since the 19th century, states fashioned societies by delimiting territories where there was a school system, there was a communication system, there was an economic market, there was an official language, there were some customs, and there were many very visible signs that that territory had some explicit limits, which were additionally controlled or defended by an army. Well, that is that kind of geographical scale is still very relevant, but it's not the only one. Within national state, we can find out places, but now we also find places that are related, that they establishing connections across boundaries. Places are territories, normally local territories, that people associate with a particular meaning. They can be, if they can feel they are identified with them, they can feel they are symbolic, they are iconic, or something like that. Well, in the 19th century, geographical scales were mostly national, and social networks were established within societies. That's no longer the case. We no longer have only national scales and only national social networks. So globalization is a social change to the extent that territorial matrix changed over time. Recently, social actions also became relevant at geographical scales that operate below and above states. We can have migration networks that connect people living in different localities within different states, although these states are not clearly connected. But we can have we can also look at the operations of an international organization or at a financial market, and these are clearly above states. These are creating global geographical scales. Globalization is also a social change because since the 1980s, people also established social networks across boundaries. You have a list of phenomena that some of which we will discuss afterwards, that basically consist of creating networks across boundaries. Remember that a network is a kind of relationship where the components, the participants, can easily change their connections. They are connected to somebody for a particular time, for a particular reason, but they can easily change this connection for other reasons in different moments, or they can have different arrays of connections, invariable arrays of connections. Well, social networks were mostly national in the 19th and early 20th century. They are no longer. They are national, but they are also transnational and international. They are transnational to the extent that they cut across borders, and they are global to the extent that they create a geographical state above states. Now we are going to discuss a number of theoretical questions that both the theories of international relations and sociology have proposed in order to analyze political globalization. The first one is, who are the political actors? I suggest that you look at these slides as reminders of the number of an array of political analytical theories that will be extremely helpful in order to make sense of your work on a global corporation. Who are the political actors? According to IR realism, these are states. Actually, the point is that international relations are anarchical because eventually no supranational authority can enforce rules over states. States are the main subject of international relations. There is no properly an international law because this law is not really coercive. However, other scholars claim that there is a sort of political globalization, that something else, that the interaction between states is taking place, and is particularly relevant. I think that we can label this thesis as the globalization thesis. In this view, there is a political globalization to the extent that international organizations, advocacy networks, corporations, and any other actors play a growing role. They are also becoming political actors that can interpellate states. Some of them are even bigger than many states. Many corporations have a bigger budget than many states, for instance. That's a key point of the discussion on political globalization nowadays. Second question: what agency is at stake? As you see, we are revisiting some of the main concepts that we discussed previously. Political actors are single agents who deploy rational choice. Two strands of scholarship in international relations normally make this assumption. Some realists do that. They look at the strategies of states and how they are interacting, they are related to each other, and they have attempted to account for war and peace on these grounds for a long time. But interdependency theorists like Robert Keohane, have also argued that we have to look at the states, but we have to look at at international organizations too and corporations, but you have to think of them as rational actors who have explicit preferences and they try to do the best to get their best, the best outcome for them. Another strand of scholarship argues that political actors are unstable and potentially contradictory assemblages of institutions and networks. So you cannot take for granted that they are a unity. I normally label this approach as the ideas coming from post-structuralism and post-colonialism. That is to say, a kind of analytic approach that tries to spell out the factors, the conditions that facilitated the emergence of the modern subjectivity, no longer assuming that an individual rational subject is taken for granted. In the 20th century, other actors, other theories argue that an international society emerged, so that the anarchy that realists had taken for granted is no longer the case. This international society has created its own social norms. So in this sense, it has created a new kind of agency, because we can analyze international social norms in a similar way as we do with social norms in other contexts, but we have to be aware that these norms are there and that governments may feel uncomfortable if they break the rule, or may look for exceptions, but they may do their best not to openly break some rules. So we have to look at how political actors enact these norms. But I mentioned governments, but you can think of corporations too. They can have the same point. Well, this is the English school in international relations, but the point is very similar to one of the main assumptions of the sociological institutionalism school, and actually we will be reading a piece by sociologist John Mayer in this vein. Here we have a short mention to another issue. Which sources of power do these actors use? Which sources of power are related to these different types of agency? Of course, we have military power, as realism has convincingly argued for a long time. But political economy also adds a very interesting point to this assumption. Be aware that the main actors also use economic and political power. Economic power is easily observable. We can observe economic power quite easily by looking at the budget and the resources of these actors. What about political power? Here you have two interesting illustrations of what political power is. It has to do with organization, but it has also to do with collective action. However, in contrast, interdependency theory claims that the main actors do not use political power, but choose rationally which organizational fields they enter. By organizational fields, you can also read social fields. Some corporations decide to create a foundation to regulate how they manage forests, or how they manage water, or how they apply some quality assurance mechanisms. In this view, this is not power properly. It's simply a rational strategy to improve the activity in some ways. Well, this discussion between political economy and interdependency is a particularly relevant one for the analysis of political globalization. Finally, we have ideological power. For realists, ideological power basically consisted of lying cynically. That's a very clear statement. For post-colonialists, eventually the North compels the South to define itself through imposed ideas. So there is a kind of subtle ideological power at stake. However, since truth and ignorance play their own role, transparency can result in perverse effects. So it's not obvious that transparency democratizes political international politics in a straightforward way. We will read a piece by Maillard and Margouy that make this point, this interesting point on ideological power. We cannot think of political globalization regardless of time. Actually, the national state endeavored to create a particular view of time. National states narrate national histories. Bureaucracy patterns time. Over any government produces a national budget and reviews it yearly. So, budget clearly affects our view of time. That's approach to time can be, or that way of constructing time has been labeled as modern, since it was associated with other modern changes regarding technology or regarding the making of the national state. The UN also has complemented this view of modern time. The UN has progressively substituted anarchy by an international society. The debate I already mentioned. That has also created an image of modern time that is that in this case it is elaborated through bureaucratic procedures such as assemblies or 10-year programs or international pieces of international legislation that actually become valid from a certain point in time, from a certain moment. That modern time is still there. We can claim that political globalization has complemented or has introduced more complexity to this picture, but it has not deleted or has not substituted these views of modern time. Actually, right now we are witnessing the emergence of kinds of agency that eventually create a variety of perceptions and images of time. I posited 4 examples here. We will discuss them in different points. International organizations work in the midterm. I already mentioned the 10-year programs, but financial time is very short. Finance operates at very short time periods. In economic globalization, in the lecture on economic globalization, we will discuss global value chains. The point is that they need a longer. They are part of a component of economic globalization, but they need longer time periods. And the civil society expresses some sort of biographical time. People engage in civil society organizations depending on their experience of different moments of their biography. So it's not such an abstract and anonymous time as finance or global value chains. It depends on how people construct some meaning. Well, I will briefly introduce a number of cases that you can use in order to illustrate these theories and also to analyze global corporations. One of them, you have the emergence of private authorities. Now we cannot only assume that governments and international regulations participate in global governance. We have a number of more or less informal practices that are really relevant in global social fields and contribute to establish very relevant international social norms. Here you have an illustration of them. Let me briefly remind you that interdependency and political economy understand private authorities in a very different way. For interdependency theorists, private authorities are the outcome of rational choices. For political economy theories, private authorities are the outcome of power relations, mostly related to capitalism. We also have the global civil society. And the global civil society gathers all these. You have an illustration of the kind of subjects or political actors that participate in the global civil society. It's such an heterogeneous set that this is only an illustration. Here you have two different interpretations too. For realism, this is eventually subordinated to states. For liberalism and sociological institutionalism, the global civil society contributes to the making of an international society. For some Spurgeon social movements, such as John Dreiser, the global civil society is a particularly source of inspiration and creativity, so it makes a difference, it provokes very relevant social changes. Here you have a set of hypotheses that you can contrast with the evidence that you are analyzing when you look at a global corporation. Finally, we have global cities. Global cities are deeply connected or tightly connected between them. Although they are at a distance, they are quite close in the networks of international relations in global geographical scales. Actually, knowledge and infrastructures are concentrated in some global cities. Although we can operate throughout the worldwide, because if we use IT, although we can do that very easily, infrastructures and knowledge are still concentrated in some particular points, mostly in global cities. Saskia Sassen not only makes this point on global cities, but she also adds a further point regarding the role of collective action in global cities. And she shows how some particularly social movements became very visible because they have managed to be visible in global cities. That was the case of the GLBT movement in San Francisco in the 70s and 80s. It has been the case of migrants in Europe. It was the case of migrants in Europe in 2015. They crossed the border, said we are heading Berlin, we are heading London, we are heading Paris, we're going there. And it is the case of the victims of gentrification in global cities too. So in this lecture, in order to rewrap, I want you to be aware of a concept of globalization, but additionally want you to be aware of 4 theoretical debates. The first one about who are the political actors, the second one about agency, the third one about the sources of power, and the fourth one about temporalities. I think and I hope that this conceptual introduction will be really helpful for your analysis of a global corporation. Think that global corporations are cases that you can analyze drawing on some of the theories that have been applied to private authorities, to global civil society, and to global cities. Thank you very much for your attention.